if you look at almost every other industry, ours is I would argue, the least technologically enabled and the least open about sharing. And that's weird. I mean, when we grew up in architecture studio, like in those like kind of coming of age days as architects or architectural designers, like, or students, whatever you want to call it, we learned from other folks. You look at people's books of their stuff and you got inspired about the kinds of things that you could design.
Hey everyone, thanks for listening to another episode of Buildings 2.0. Today we have a special episode with Preston Smith, head of BIM Operations at Integrated Projects, my colleague. So Preston, thanks for joining.
Thanks for having me.
Talk to me a little bit about some of the products you've been working on. So in addition to producing the most BIM and CAD files in the world, we're also thinking about the derivatives, the data, the other ways we could create value. What are some of those that are top of mind?
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting things about our team, our company, is that we've got this process that goes from scan to BIM. And from BIM, you can get a bunch of derivatives as opposed to scan to CAD to BIM and so on, which I would ultimately view as a lot less efficient and not as useful. When you start from a BIM, there's a series of other things that you can create. So there's the model itself, the 3D assets, which of course exists within the BIM. And then we started to work on this reporting feature. If you look at IPX, ultimately what you'll see is sort of this quantities of stuff, all the stuff you have in a model. And you can answer a lot of questions with that stuff. But what we often find is that people want very specific questions answered. Like, I want to know exactly how many linear feet of duct there are in this building.
And that's typically for the purpose of renovation or some
exactly. This could be for purpose of renovation. That could be the purpose of let's say I'm a fireproofing insulator. I need to kind of coat all of these columns and various different things with insulation, as opposed to me going to a site and running through this entire thing. If I could look at a building and just get that information straight off, like there is 1,000 linear feet in this one space, that's me saving money and time to understand whether I even want to bid on that job. So that's a really, really powerful thing. Like, that's a much more down the road kind of thing. But the report itself, let's say for a building owner, that helps them understand. Imagine if you could just look at a report of your existing conditions, and now you understand life safety questions. Like, is this building actually built up to code? If you change something here, are you going to be faced with all of these issues because now you have to bring it up to code? Does it have enough of your, for lack of a better term, stuff in it? Or do you need more stuff? Where is that stuff? All of those kinds of questions as an owner or even as a tenant that's working within that owner space, those are things we should be answering pretty quickly, I think, the report. Beyond that, you can go even further. Like, BIMs are immensely useful for other folks that are trying to design, trying to start, as I think you've put it pretty well before, as on the 50-yard line. That's immensely possible with a BIM. So if you start with this thing and you find out, okay, actually I need to shift these walls here and here and here, that's a matter of shifting. That's not a matter of completely redesigning everything around it just to do a couple of small modifications. So you can get a lot from a BIM, and its derivatives can give you a lot of answers really quickly.
To shift gears on one of your passions, you started actually at the top of the hour talking about you wanting to be a writer.
Yeah.
You're coming now back full circle, writing about your experiences, leading a team, the industry, technicalities of BIM. As a team, I think we have a propensity to be open about where we're going. How do you think about that as we put out content, not just for ourselves, but for the industry?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at almost every other industry, ours is I would argue, the least technologically enabled and the least open about sharing. And that's weird. I mean, when we grew up in architecture studio, like in those kind of coming of age days as architects or architectural designers, or students, whatever you want to call it, we learned from other folks. You look at people's books of their stuff and you got inspired about the kinds of things that you could design. I don't think that the industry goes anywhere without sharing the things that you're tackling, because if you can teach somebody else how to solve the problem that you're trying to solve, or just even putting it out there, what you'll probably find is that there are a dozen different solutions that might have come a different way, and that can help you solve the next problem faster and faster and faster. So oftentimes people think that, hoarding your knowledge is going to somehow save you I don't agree. I think the more surface area you have to exposing yourself to others, again, in this specific circumstance, the more propensity you have to solve a problem, and the more likely you are to find somebody to help you solve that problem when you can't solve it.
I would even add to that I think when you consider the built environment, there's so many different stakeholders around the table that by hoarding knowledge, what we're actually doing is kind of keeping the physical asset behind itself. Right?
Totally.
So if you've got an owner, builder, architect, engineer, you kind of need to know a little bit about the building in order for us to all kind of proactively do something about it. Otherwise, kind of just stuck in limbo land. But
100%.
that's one of the things that keeps me up at night, I think, is one thing is getting the right information. Another thing is once you get the right information, trying to make it simple to connect it to the right folks at the right time.
And to make sure that they can actually find you.
And they can find you.
Yeah. I think what is interesting right now is like having a network of folks that can come in and look at the same set of data can get you a lot more. So if I'm an owner and now I need to figure out how to renovate my space. Right now you have this entire process where you create an RFP and like people have to kind of bid on this and whatever. Like what if you didn't have to do that? Like what if no one had to spend any time on that and you just clicked a button on somebody's platform and says bid on renovating my space? Like that would be a much more interesting idea because you have all the digital assets. Everything's there. Anybody can get it. Somebody could come to you with something that you had no idea. Like you would have never even thought of that. Instead, you only go to the folks that are within your network to kind of solve for, and you're going to always pay a certain amount to do it, So this is kind of like the idea of one of those things that I'd always got excited about when I was coming out of school, which were competitions. You'd have these big competitions, people would just open it up, and then you get together with like 2 or 3 of your friends as like studio mates, and you're like, what if we tried it this way? And then you come up with 100 different things, and you have silly, stupid names and these like kind of ridiculous renderings, and they're all awesome. Like this idea generation is this incredible thing that ultimately surfaced up oftentimes like incredible solutions like the High Line or Little Island over there off the coast of Chelsea. Like those kind of things happen because people open up these competitions for folks to interact with other people, and it makes for a much better end result.
One of the things that stands out is that I think the different flavors within folks coming from architecture and design, there's a school of thought really preoccupied with how novel can we design certain forms.
Yep.
From those schools of thought, you get folks like the Zaha Hadids of the world, the Frank Gehry's of the world, the Renzo Pianos of the world, and where like the kind of the style of their tectonics and forms kind of define them. One of the things noticeably different about the way you approach architecture is just you actually haven't mentioned much of that and spent more time talking about just like where there's kind of the data itself and the process of building. Are you unique? Is that representative of like a kind of a certain school of thought that we're just shifting? Perhaps maybe the last decade or so we were more concerned with form, and now we're actually concerned with data. Or how do you think about that?
That's interesting. I don't know. I mean, I think part of it, at least in my case, comes from the people that I most admired. Like again, I loved the Zahas and the various folks. Like I would say like one of my like if I had to like put my like Starchitect star out there, it was the firm Big was one of my favorites. I love diagrams. Anybody that knows me that I love diagrams, and watching their diagrams, like watching someone tell a simple story with pictures, it was just like I'm 5 years old again and I'm reading a comic book. Like this is perfect. And not only that, but it ends up looking elegant and just like it really does effectively tell the story. In order to do that, you needed these sort of like technological solutions oftentimes to kind of get it right. And then like that led to more data about things that you needed, right? And so the confluence really of those two ideas, like being diagrammatic and being data driven, happened around the same time for me. I think they're happening for a lot of folks that are in this space of digital innovation. And it's not so much that the form doesn't matter anymore, but I don't want to call it a hot take, but this is definitely my take. It's just like, I mean, does that matter? Like, are there that many buildings in the world that are being built with these like weirdly like organic shapes? It's like, that for me is not where the most interesting part of the problem gets solved. It is cool, don't get me wrong, and please no one like come after me for that one. But it is not for me what I think is like, oh wow, this is why I do design. It's just it's the, icing on top to an extent.
Yeah. I think I asked myself the same because I find myself, I'm also in some ways kind of got it out of my system where I remember there's a particular year in graduate school where we had two professors. They encouraged us with a prompt, and it was that you have 1 week to pick one New York City block, divide it into 4 or 5,
Mhm.
and you have a week to just kind of design a unique building on each plot of land, effectively making kind of like a suite of 4 or 5 buildings.
Oh, wow.
And you had about a week. And I remember taking the opportunity to just kind of get a lot of things out of my system. Like I wanted to like stylistically just kind of get curves, angles, orthogonals, whatever tectonic moves I wanted to, and just kind of get it out of my system. And I think that was, I kind of, as you're talking, kind of thought about, okay, I think there's a generation of folks that kind of got a lot of the debates out of their system about formalities of, curves and angles and all this stuff. And there's room for all of it. But now I think in this generation, I think having an appreciation for kind of performance or data as a more interested in kind of in the process of making any one of the
Totally.
forms and the kind of form itself, and like kind of, hanging your hat on one particular style.
Yeah. It's also about the problem itself. Like, which problem are you most interested in solving? And that might be even just like an age or time thing. Like when I was in school, stylistically, the most important things was like trying to be like new and edgy and whatever. And like, let's say like I just finished talking like maybe 2 days ago with one of my best friends who showed me a project that she and I worked on together in our 3rd year. It was like trying to do housing in this suburban area, but introducing an urban density to it. And we came up with a not really good name. And I'm going to blame myself for it. It was called Urban Niche. It was not a good name. It was a terrible, terrible name. But the point is like, as we were trying to solve for this, it was like, we were trying to make something that looked cool. It didn't really solve the problem. So like now, if I were trying to do this, I'd be like, I want to solve the problem of housing. Like that's a much more interesting problem for you to solve, not stylistically, like in terms of scale and et cetera. Like, how do you solve that problem? I think that's a much more interesting thing. So yeah, I think all of those things kind of play into it is like you kind of, for lack of a better term, like graduated to like new kinds of problem solving.
Sure. I think one of the appreciations that I've gotten, certainly now we've been in the industry for some years, is there's that kind of saying where like, if you have a hammer, everything seems to be a nail kind of thing. When you're in graduate school, specifically for design, everything seems to kind of be addressed through layouts or your choice of tectonic, opaque, opacity, kind of the different ingredients required in design. But you start to realize like there's actually other considerations that have to do with economic and social and a few other things. And even touching on what you mentioned about housing, the art of building a house is one thing, but doing this at scale and having an appreciation for the economics that are required, the supply chains, the people, or rather the lack thereof people ready to kind of get into construction to build these houses, the social implications of the levee towns versus the others. And I think this is not so much a question, but rather just an observation about just the necessity for us as folks in the built environment to just kind of expand our appreciation for the various factors.
Yes.
Right. Required to.
It's funny you mentioned that. I've been thinking about this because it kept like flashing in my head. In my thesis here, I had an opportunity to pick from 2 professors, one of which was like one of my dearest mentors, and who was much more interested in like, I wouldn't say like form, but like, again, the thing that I was most interested in, the more narrative aspect of design. And another who was more interested in the economic aspect of design. He actually worked for a developer. He worked in that space. Like he worked in the space of economics. And I was like, I don't want to go with this guy. Like, I don't like, and I was getting pushed by so many people to move towards this problem. And I think this is maybe the one hot take I take. This is one of the failures of architecture school, is only glorifying the formality, like the prestigiousness of being an architect, as opposed to like the problem solving, like truly here's where the rubber meets the road aspect of things. Because if we had more of the folks that solve for form on that part of the problem, we'd probably get a much more interesting solution that cost a lot less, that made everybody a lot happier. I'm not saying like this would be the, society solving problem of all things, but like with fewer people in that space, you are by virtue of it going to have less interesting solutions. And it's one that, as we all know right now, is like, it's one that needs a really, really innovative solution.
You just got me thinking. One of the things that I find myself is, as a founder of a company, is that I find that I spend a lot of my time thinking, how can I provide the team, specifically like the leadership team, like a broad set of context to just make sure that with every decision, there's a set of considerations that are broad and like necessary, right?
Yep.
So to kind of simplify, I guess, one scenario, it's like I often think about, well, if someone is only thinking about the kind of ramifications in terms of design, okay, that's one of a few aspects, right? Like how do we kind of create a system of different frameworks to kind of think about like all the different implications that like we need to consider when making a decision.
Yeah.
Again, just general observation about like how do we build better buildings, but also just build better businesses that are just more informed and kind of like take more into account than one side or maybe two sides of a multi-sided thing.
Totally.
And that kind of oscillation between like complexity, while at the same time realizing that like to move an organization forward, what I find myself is actually having to narrow focus in.
Yeah.
So that constant tension of like trying to grasp the complexity while at the same time kind of narrowing down on like what matters is something that I...
Yeah, I mean, you said it perfectly. It's a tension, right? Because you do kind of have to consistently expand and narrow your focus. I think, well, I mean, in your case, you have a much more difficult problem because as the founder, as a CEO, like you have to have the vision and then you have to also manage people that don't have your same perspective, right? But I think one of the things that I've learned from the experience of working in this new space, like as a manager, as a part of a leadership team in the business is like, it's just what you said, like, and you've said this before as well in the past. I've heard it from my own professors. It doesn't matter like the blood, sweat, and tears. Like it matters the result. Like you have to be focused on a result. So we like the fact that we have success metrics, like things like that, like keep you keenly focused on what is the right thing to be doing. The idea of like secondary and like tertiary effects like helps you account for the fact that there's going to be things outside of your frame that you maybe don't want to affect by doing a thing. So you're not just focused like short term on a problem solving kind of thing, and you're able to kind of more holistically like wrap your hands around the problem when you solve it. I think that is one of the like keys to making sure that you are thinking correctly when you're trying to solve the problem.
And I think that's the tension that I find myself like going back and forth with. Like I consider like two different scenarios. And it's funny that we keep going back to like graduate school or like college days. But I had one professor, this was like, I guess maybe first or second year in college, where very much was interested in making sure that we were reading or writing as a way to kind of inspire the decisions we made in designing. And when we ultimately went to go present the projects, he was as interested in hearing kind of the inputs as opposed to the outputs, right? So I think kind of as one framing, that was kind of one take. I had then another professor, I think around fourth year. He didn't care what you were inspired by, what you read. He was like, what I'm looking at the wall sucks. I don't care what inspired you. And I had actually, I gained an appreciation. He was, I think, albeit his delivery was a little rough, equipped with like a rough like Spaniard accent. But I appreciated actually that, because at the end of the day, he reminded me, he's like, look, Jose, or he would tell the class, he was like, 95% of people will never actually walk into the building that you're like, they're going to look at the building and they're going to make a judgment call as to like whether or not they like it. Have you ever considered what are the specific decisions that this architect made, whether big, small, close by, spread apart, opaque, like all of the different decisions, material, concrete versus glass, like that came together to make this particular thing that we're all looking at more desirable than that particular thing.
100%.
It was very much kind of like this kind of materialistic. But I gained an appreciation for both. Is like there's, in some sense, business has a way of kind of just being like, what we're looking at, we like or we don't like.
Yep.
And then of course, when you run the business, there's a way to have an appreciation for the inputs, right, that people take, and as sometimes more importantly than like what's actually resulted, because that's just important too. But of the many tensions that I guess we oscillate from, I don't know if that's something you
No, that resonates, like that resonates very, very hard. I think the reason why we keep coming back to studio is because studio is actually a really, really good, like that space is a really, really great place for idea generation. And so it is a missed opportunity that we don't get to inject the business aspect into. Well, I don't know, maybe I take that back. Maybe because you don't inject the business aspect of things at a certain point, it becomes such this rich space for ideas to generate and germinate. I don't know. I haven't, I'd have to like really like tease that out. But
Mm.
what I would say is like, I think about studio in my like more professional work life all the time. Whenever I'm trying to give someone advice on something, whenever I'm trying to bite my own tongue about how I'm going to respond to something, whenever I'm trying to find the best way to solve a problem, every single time it comes back to something I learned in that time. And the ways in which I try and problem solve come back to that. So it's funny because like I think that architects are like these like they're like stem cells or something. Like they can like just kind of morph into anything and like you just learn all these different ways to problem solve. And all that comes from the training that you get when you're in studio and like the way you learn to problem solve.
Mm.
But it becomes this rich, fertile ground for you to go back to and just be like, am I doing this right?
Outside of architecture, who are some of the biggest influences in your life?
Oh man. Personally, it all comes down to family. My mom and I are pretty close. My brothers and I are especially close. So my family, in particular, somebody who I'd be very hurt if I didn't mention, as my grandmother. Like this is the hardest working person I've ever met in my entire life. She raised 3 kids, moved from deep South up to New York in the 70s, which is just a huge story. Went from being basically a typist in the typing pool to, if I remember correctly, like I want to say like a vice president of a large financial firm by the time she was retired. She's an incredible person professionally, but an incredible person like personally, just somebody that has guided me all throughout my life and just taught me how to be, I hope, at my best, patient and hardworking. And like any of the good qualities I have came from lessons I learned from her. If I were to say professionally, man, like I'll tell you people that I've been most inspired to listen to and like that give me ideas every day. Ezra Klein, anybody who knows me like knows that I love public policy. I'm a big, big nerd. In that same vein, Ta-Nehisi Coates, I don't know how else to speak about him other than say he's an amazing writer of everything and everything that I would ever read. I mean, those are probably the folks that kind of like are top of mind for me right now. I'm sure that there are others that now that I have this question on me, I'm not going to be embarrassed that I don't remember. Professionally, I would say those folks are folks that I think about often. They're people that, for me at least, evoke a sense of how you can actually bring the best out of yourself by collaborating with other people. Like that, if I were to ever like say like I need one sentence to define me when I'm gone, I was like, it would be that. Like you probably get the best out of yourself when you work with other people, not by working by yourself. And they bring out these like really, really incredible ideas that people have to, and like me in particular, like I have to sit with it after like, whoa, what is that? You know, like kind of have to think about. So
I love that one.
Okay.
We should we should end with it. That was really thoughtful. You also said there was you had like a moment there was like and then you
yeah.
it was
There was a director I was gonna say, but he's kind of a weird one. There's this guy named Lars von Trier. He's a weird director. He makes very, very problematic movies. Problematic for any number of reasons, but the reason why I like him is because I kind of hate him a little bit. Like anytime you go into one of his movies, you are intensely frustrated. It's one of those things where I don't know a lot about art in the general sense, but one person that I did know that knew a lot about art was like the only thing that you can say about art and whether or not it's successful is whether it evoked an emotion within you, and he evokes a lot of emotions within me, positive or negative. So, but yeah.
I'm always interested in the mechanics. Like what are some of the mechanics behind the movies that stand out to me?
Probably one of his, I would argue, I don't know if it's one of his best, but it's one of my favorites was Melancholia. And that one's a weird one. The long story short version of it is that there's something coming towards the planet, and it's going to like basically kill everyone. And Kirsten Dunst is getting married to Alexander Skarsgård. I want to say is like this like really big dude. And I want to say like her sister is Charlotte Gainsborough. And so like there's this weird interaction where she's depressed. She's getting married, but she's depressed about it. And everyone's like super happy for her. And she's like kind of walking around with it. And then when she finds out that the world is ending, everything switches. She's the one that's like super happy and everyone else is like down in the dumps. And just like the kind of interesting like vibe shift that happens throughout this very, very strange film that's just visually like extraordinary. Yeah, like there's a lot of things that happen with that, but that one really strikes me. He's
kind of like the juxtaposition of the, or like, and
yes,
also it seems like also like the simplicity of the
exactly
the plot, but also like just
exactly. It's a super simple plot, just well executed, and like, and then at the very end, when you think you know exactly how it's, he subverts your expectations. It's annoying. It's like, man, you're a jerk. Like, but it's cool. It's an interesting idea.
Is there any translation to like that and like how you think about designing systems or designing in this case?
I think so. I think that the expected thing is the boring thing in most cases. But I also think that if you design something in a way that immediately resonates with somebody, like it resonates with anybody, like everybody just like gets it. That's incredible. And I think that also comes from studio. Like the idea is like you put your stuff up on the board and it's like a joke. If you have to explain it, then like it didn't work. Like that level of execution is what you strive for. And like almost none of us reach it, but sometimes art reaches it, sometimes film reaches it, where you're just like, you did the moment so right that, everybody gets it.
No. Acronyms. There's no shortage of them in the industry. EDC, BIM, IFC, RVT,
VDC,
DWG,
all of it,
etc.
Yeah.
Help us demystify what we're talking about here. When we talk about digital technologies, design technologies, BIM management, BIM operations, so many permutations, like what matters, help us kind of provide some sort of framework as to how you see it, as well as what you're working on.
Yeah. So our team added a new acronym to the mix. We call it BIM Ops. Now this one has like two divergent histories that I may go into it, we'll see, but I would say that it kind of sits in the same idea at the edge of what BIM departments have become. So BIM, simply building information modeling. And when BIM departments kind of came about, like in the early 2000s, so on, they were really focused on just an advanced version of what CAD departments were focused on. And CAD departments were just focused on line weights. They're focused on making sure that when a drawing went out the door, it looked the same as every other drawing that went out the door for that company. And that was really, really important to a firm to make sure that they had this kind of standard set. But what it ended up meaning for a lot of firms is that you had a bunch of people that were really, really well educated and have these incredible chops that were like focused on printer settings. And it's not an especially value providing part of the firm. It becomes a support portion of your firm. Instead, what I've seen is that people have differentiated themselves from that first state as digital technology leaders, as innovation leaders, as practice operations. Those folks focused on way different things. They focused on how do you use Rhino to get this incredible shape you could never get within Revit? Like, how do you actually affect the design process? Some of them focused on introducing technology, like truly like software, like database, like, software type technology into your design process as well, or into the larger firm as a whole. One of the things we worked on in a previous iteration of a job I worked at was like something as simple as trying to track time within Revit so that we could properly account for how we were billing our clients. These were not things that people were talking about before. Again, like this is not the PIN settings firm. So BIM Ops is very different. We don't design. We model existing conditions, but we do it at this really, really huge scale. I mean, hundreds of people are doing. Well, at one of our points, we're doing 6 buildings a day, and now we're trying to get up to 60 buildings a day. That's a scale that most people are not really used to in terms of this kind of practice. So the questions that we're trying to answer and the problems we're trying to solve inherently end up being very different. We're focused on how you can do X at scale, like whatever X might be. That can be trying to model, trying to submit, trying to send things to people. How do you produce derivatives and artifacts from the BIMs that you have, again, at scale? So it's not just somebody sitting down and like drawing a thing and trying to like kind of like fit it out. You have to create a pipeline and like think about all of the different problems that are going to happen when you're trying to create that pipeline. Our team is like, I'm so impressed by the work that they do and that we do in general, because we end up trying to solve a problem, like really identify what that problem is and solve it. Then we end up trying to operationalize it. So how do you do this not just one time, but like 10 times? And how you can do it 10 times, you productize it and you make it into like a million. I don't think that most people in like practice operations and design technology, like that they're focused on that right now. I think we kind of have a different lens on a very similar problem, but a lot of the same skills are in play. When you were first starting the company, it was, as I remember you telling me, just you and your brother, and then you had to add probably one more person. What was it that you started to think about when you first added that first person to the team?
You're about to unearth some deep trauma with this one.
Okay.
I think a lot of the decisions in the early days had more to do with just necessity.
Fair.
But to answer that question clearly, adding that next person was particularly personal because keeping in mind that I was almost running away from an industry that is very much known for overworking folks and underpaying folks. And so one of the decisions that was particularly personal for me was that if I was in a position to be able to even afford to bring on a third person, that I wanted to make sure that we created a business that could sustainably pay that person and pay that person a respectable salary. Of course, we're paying tech salaries at the time, but just something that was respectable. That was a particularly important thing, for me. And I think in just general, like I've always believed that, and I'm coming from a little bit of a trauma where I remember after graduate school, we worked for incredible firms, but you would on the door, you'd have these incredible brands.
Mm-hmm.
But what we were actually getting paid as a kind of entry-level architect, it was just not sustainable. And so I promised myself is if I were ever to do my own thing, I would want to build a business that was sustainable enough where you didn't have to like exploit folks' time and it could afford to pay people what I believe they're worth. So I think that was just a general framework.
Yep.
I think naturally though, there is a tension, which is that's an aspiration, but the realities of business are often a lot less. They're a lot more grim, especially in the early days. Where I think I shared this with you, but when I started the company, I naively thought that $12,000 in my savings account was enough to afford me a buffer in New York City to buy me about 6 months of time.
Yeah.
Woefully wrong and woefully miscalculated that. It was more like 2 months time, but I think as part of that calculation, it, number one, forced me to have an appreciation for, okay, there's the promised land is like what we'd like to build, but there's also a reality of like rent being due. And that kind of that saying you've heard me talk about, just having an appreciation for making sure that you can make that first dollar and ideally quickly forces you to create a framework where it's like, okay, well, there's what I would like to do, but I also have to pay rent. So what are folks needing like today? And ideally, I could solve that in a way that gets me at least a step closer to where I think the industry should go.
And then when you were starting to think about growing the team, so now you're in a much more comfortable position, what have you found is what trends across the people that have been most impactful here that you've most connected with that have like pushed the organization forward?
I think the kinds of people you look for does evolve depending on the chapter that the business is in. But I do think that there's some universal threads that have to be true.
Mm-hmm.
I think before starting IP, I think one of the things that I also promised myself was making sure that if in fact life is short, then making sure that the folks that you put around you, you genuinely admire and like.
Totally.
Because otherwise just waking up kind of sucks. So I had one or two roles where, you'd wake up and it's just like the folks around you just were not at all inspiring. If anything, kind of felt like they were just like,
Mm-hmm.
like pushing you back. So I was like, okay, well, if I'm going to try to do this thing, let me at least try to surround myself with folks that I deeply like, kind,
Mm-hmm.
admire, and ideally These are folks that can roll up their sleeves. So I think I like most businesses in the early days, you definitely need the kind of the 0 to 1 folks.
Yeah.
By that, I mean the folks that there's no playbook. There's typically no, the roles themselves, the titles really kind of, we're making them up as we go.
Yeah.
One of the threads being just like, what does the customer need, and having like deep empathy, like of solving that thing by any means necessary.
Yep.
In the early days, there's really no systems. You don't have kind of thought out playbooks. And so it really is like you're living and dying with like, how well can you connect to that customer? And oftentimes in the early days, those early folks need to be able to empathize with the customer, because otherwise you kind of live and die by them saying yes and then ultimately paying you. I do think that there's a chapter in any business where you solve for something, there's a fit, people are paying you, ideally more than once, and they're coming back. And in which case you kind of then have to, what got you there might not necessarily get you to the next step, which is now kind of building systems and operations to go from 1 to 100. Mm-hmm. I do think that some folks can make that leap. It's really hard.
Yeah.
I know it's not lost on me that often founders can't make that leap, right? Yep. They're very much kind of like 0 to 1. But going from 1 to 100 is like fundamentally kind of different skill sets. And that's something I think about often. But also in the teams that we bring in that chapter, they need to have a kind of appreciation for how everything connects. Mm-hmm. Ideally simplifying as opposed to kind of adding in route to this kind of scaling. But those are skill sets, right? And those things could actually be taught, I think. I think what's harder to teach is, in any startup, is just like kind of the level of grit, as well as like empathy that you should have for your colleagues as well as everyone around you, kind of realizing that everyone's just trying to figure this thing
100%.
out. Patience is pretty key. Again, I stress kindness is super key, especially as we're trying to figure this out.
Can I tease that out? Why is kindness helpful in business?
I'd like to think that it is. I don't think it's a prerequisite. I don't think you need to be kind, but I think that maybe, again, it's one of those things where I'm kind of running from things that I maybe traumatized. One of them being, I'd like to think I'm a student of business, and you read a lot of these biographies of the Jobs of the world and others, and you see like a kind of a really concerning trend where they're highly respected in the business sense, but when you analyze like their personal life, it's like a hot mess.
Totally.
Hot mess. That actually scares me. I think I'd like to think I'm a introvert and really kind of simple in that, like, as long as family, cares, that's really what I care about. But I think I'm running away from that, from like the playbook that in order to be a success in business, you kind of need to be a little bit of an asshole.
Totally.
There are examples. Unfortunately, they don't get the most attention, but there are examples. There's a particular book that comes to mind, Good to Great, where they mention that the kinds of leaders that you would think are good for an organization to go from good to great are the most charismatic. Whereas, there's been studies made about how actually some of the best leaders are more of the Lincoln types, the Abraham Lincoln types, where a little bit more quiet, reserved. They don't necessarily get the headlines, a little bit more patient, but kind of over time kind of drive greatness in an organization. I think about this a lot because the characteristics that are business success, as well as just being personally successful with your friends, family, et cetera, are actually not the same. And so I holding those two things in tension, and at least kind of holding a bar to ourselves of just making sure that we are driving business growth, but also just remaining good humans is it's a personal thing. But to answer your question, I don't know if that's a requisite to be successful. I'd hope it'd be, but
I think it is, based on things that I've seen from you. Like you've mentioned it before, and I've seen it in others that we've worked with, that where folks are, because they are kind, it's easier to go with them and to follow them in a direction that maybe you don't really always trust, because it's like, well, they wouldn't lead me down a bad path. Like it's a lot easier to do that with somebody you feel is being kind to you than you hate. It's also maybe in the most like Machiavellian sense, like easier to get someone to do what you want them to do if you are kind, like you catch more flies with honey, as always.
Sure.
I think that's the term.
Sure. Yeah.
But I don't know. Has that been true for you?
There's pros and cons too. I think that it's not lost on me that I I struggle in business. There's certain tough decisions you have to make with folks that like sometimes you, of course, they're not mutually exclusive, but like being kind but also firm is a thing, and that's at least being self-aware enough as a leader to know where some of your weaknesses lie. I think are key, at least to make sure that you're surrounding yourself with folks that somehow could somehow kind of counterbalance that. It's been an incredible session. With that, for folks that want to join the team, how do they find you?
Yeah.
Join the team or work with you or or even just dive in?
I would say, so I'm actually starting a Substack pretty soon. I'm going to be focused on a lot of the problems we talked about today. You can find me there. I will post something in the show notes, I guess. Once I've not quite settled on a name. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm Preston Smith. And yeah, those are probably the best places to look for me.
Awesome. It's been fun.
Thanks.